Porsche 989 is the car that could have changed the brand's history long before the Cayenne and Panamera. Imagine a four-door Porsche from the early 1990s, looking like an elegantly stretched 911, with a front-mounted V8 engine, rear-wheel drive, a sporty interior, and the ambition to challenge the BMW M5 and the strongest Mercedes sedans. Today, that idea shocks nobody. Porsche has been selling the Panamera, Macan, Cayenne, and Taycan for years. But in the late 1980s, it was almost an attack on something sacred. The Stuttgart brand was associated mainly with the 911, motorsport, low cars, and two-door bodies. The 989 was supposed to change all of that. It was meant to be a Porsche for more than two people. A family sports car, a sedan for a driver who loved the 911 but needed room for a family. The project was bold, logical, and visionary. The problem was that it appeared at the worst possible moment, when Porsche simply had no money for risk. The story of the 989 begins during a very difficult period for Porsche. In the mid-1980s, sales still looked decent, but by the end of the decade, the situation was getting worse very quickly. The 944 and 928 were aging. The 911 in the 964 generation was still based on an old architecture, and the weak dollar was hurting exports to the United States. Porsche was prestigious, but small and financially vulnerable. In 1988, production was just over 30,000 cars, and profits were almost symbolic. For a sports car manufacturer, that meant one thing. Porsche had to find a new segment, new customers, and a new reason for people to keep buying its cars. That is when the idea of a four-door sports car appeared. Not a family sedan in the ordinary sense, but a fast luxury saloon with Porsche character. A car that could combine the practicality of a BMW 5 Series with the emotion of a 911. Behind the project was Ulrich Bez, an engineer and manager who came to Porsche from BMW Technik. Bez understood that Porsche could not live forever only on traditional sports cars. He also knew that the BMW M5 had proved there was a market for fast, expensive, and practical sedans. But there was one huge difference. BMW could spread the cost of the M5 over the massive production numbers of the regular 5 Series. Porsche would have to create almost everything from scratch. Even so, the idea was tempting. The 928, which had once been intended to replace the 911, had not fulfilled every expectation. It was expensive, complicated, and not practical enough as a family car. The 989 was supposed to solve that problem. Keep the sporting character, but add 4 doors, 4 proper seats, and a luxurious interior. That is why this was much more than a loose concept. Porsche seriously considered putting it into production around 1995. The styling of the 989 was developed by a team led by Harm Lagaay, one of the most important Porsche designers of the late 20th century. Lagaay had a difficult task: to create a car that was new, larger, and 4-door, but still instantly recognizable as a Porsche. The result was fascinating. The 989 looked like an elegant fastback with soft lines, a long hood, a short rear end, and the silhouette of a stretched 911 from the future. Looking at it today, you can immediately see hints of the later 993, 996, and even the Panamera. Its front lights, gently shaped fenders, and sloping roofline were especially distinctive. Interestingly, Porsche also commissioned an alternative design from Idle Design, but the Italian proposal was judged to be less suitable for the identity of the brand. The in-house Porsche version won, more conservative, but far more Porsche-like. Technically, the Porsche 989 was meant to be a front-engined, rear-wheel drive car. That made it different from the 911, but it connected it to the 928. Porsche planned to use a water-cooled V8 engine, most often described as being around 3.6 to 4.2 liters in displacement. Depending on the source, power was expected to be around 300, 320, or even 350 horsepower. More ambitious plans suggested that later versions could produce more than 400 horsepower. The engine was meant to be aluminum, modern, and powerful enough for the 989 to compete with the strongest German sedans. Porsche also considered using and heavily modifying an Audi V8 engine, which could have reduced costs, although that idea would have been controversial among Porsche purists. Whatever the engine source, the goal was clear. The 989 was supposed to be a true sports sedan, not a luxury limousine pretending to be a Porsche. The planned performance was impressive for a four-door car from the early 1990s. With a weight of around 1,570 kilograms and about 350 horsepower, the car was expected to accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour in about 5.8 seconds. It was supposed to reach 200 kilometers per hour in around 20 seconds, and its top speed was expected to be around 280 kilometers per hour. These were sports car numbers, not ordinary sedan numbers. Porsche planned a manual gearbox, while an automatic Tiptronic transmission was also considered. In the future, all-wheel drive and even rear-wheel steering were discussed. All of this shows how ambitious the project was. The 989 was not meant to be just a bigger 928. It was meant to be a technological bridge between a sports Porsche and a luxurious everyday car. The interior of the 989 was designed to be luxurious, but still focused on the driver. Porsche wanted to preserve the typical cockpit atmosphere of the brand, so a classic set of round instruments was planned directly in front of the driver. At the same time, the car was supposed to offer real space for 4 people, a large trunk, and more comfort than a 911 or a 928. Some descriptions mention a luggage capacity of around 405 liters, with the rear seats in place. That detail mattered, because the 989 was aimed at customers who loved Porsche, but needed something more practical in daily life. The cabin was intended to feature high-quality materials, sports seats, a modern dashboard, and equipment worthy of the luxury class. Porsche was trying to create a car that would stop a 911 owner from having to buy a BMW or Mercedes as the family car. The project was developed very seriously. Styling models, full-size mock-ups, documentation, test mules, and technical development vehicles were all created. One of the most interesting parts of the story is that Porsche used modified Mercedes cars as test carriers for the 989's drivetrain. In one such car, based on a Mercedes W124, early versions of the engine and components were tested. Even the Mercedes badges were removed, and the car received Porsche elements such as seats and a steering wheel. This proves that the 989 was not just a beautiful model for a boardroom presentation. Porsche was actually studying how such a car would drive. A very realistic full-size model with an interior was also built, and for years it was mistaken for a running prototype because it looked almost production-ready. The biggest problem with the 989 was cost. Porsche wanted to create a new class of car, but as a small manufacturer, it did not have the economies of scale enjoyed by BMW, Mercedes, or Audi. At first, Porsche hoped the price could be kept attractive for luxury sedan customers, but the calculations quickly spiraled out of control. Some sources mention an intended price below $53,000, later more than $80,000, and in other estimates, around 150,000 Deutsche Marks. Porsche would have needed to sell around 15,000 cars per year for the project to make sense. That was extremely risky, because the BMW M5 sold in much smaller numbers, and Porsche had no regular sedan platform on which to base a sports version. Every single 989 would have had to pay for an entirely new structure. By 1991, the situation had become critical. Porsche was under financial pressure, sales were falling, and the company could not afford a project that might destroy it. At one point, development costs were estimated at enormous levels, in some accounts, hundreds of millions of Deutsche Marks, and bringing the car to production would have cost even more. The super sedan market was simply too small at the time to safely absorb such an expensive Porsche. There were also internal and political tensions. Ferdinand Piëch, connected to the Porsche family and then leading Audi, had his own interests, and the 989 could have competed with future luxury Audi models. In the end, the project was stopped in the early 1990s, with 1991 most often given as the definitive end. Ulrich Bez left Porsche soon afterward. So how many Porsche 989s were built? In production terms, 0. When it comes to physical objects, at least one highly detailed full-size styling model with an interior was created, along with rejected design proposals, scale models, wind tunnel models, and several development mules based on other cars, including Mercedes vehicles. However, it was not a complete, homologated, running prototype in the sense of a finished production car. The most famous example seen in photos is the full-size model kept in Porsche's collection. In practice, we should speak of one main preserved 989 model and several development objects. There is no production Porsche 989, no private customer cars, and no normal collector market. Even though the project was cancelled, the 989 was not completely wasted. Its influence can be seen in later Porsches. The body lines, the treatment of the headlights, the soft surface transitions, and the overall styling philosophy foreshadowed the 911 generations 993 and 996. Some people even say that the 996 looks more like a two-door interpretation of the 989 than the other way around. Some suspension ideas and packaging concepts also helped later development work. But Porsche learned the most important lesson from the failure of the 989. It could not afford to build completely new models without sharing costs and components. That is why the later Boxster and 911 Generation 996 were created with a very different logic, using a high level of shared parts. That strategy helped save the brand. From today's perspective, the Porsche 989 looks like the direct ancestor of the Panamera. Of course, the Panamera, introduced in 2009, was larger, more modern, and created in a completely different financial reality. But the idea was the same: a sporty Porsche with 4 doors, a powerful engine, and room for a family. The difference was timing. In 1991, the world was not ready, and Porsche did not have the money. In 2009, the brand had already been strengthened by the success of the Boxster, the 996, and the Cayenne. Customers had become used to the idea that Porsche could build more than traditional sports cars. The 989 was the right idea, but too early. If it had entered production, it could have defined Porsche's sports sedan segment almost 2 decades sooner. So how much could the Porsche 989 be worth today? Since no production version exists, and the car has never been sold at auction as a normal collector's vehicle, there is no real market price. But if Porsche ever decided to sell the preserved 989 model or a complete development object, it would be a sensation. As a unique prototype, the ancestor of the Panamera, and one of the most important unrealized projects in Porsche history, it could reach a very high figure. A cautious estimate would be several million euros, perhaps between 3 and 8 million, depending on whether the object being sold was only a static model or also a working technical prototype. If it came with full factory documentation and official Porsche prototype status, the price could be even higher. In practice, for the Porsche Museum, such a car is priceless. The Porsche 989 remains one of the most fascinating, unrealized projects in the history of the brand. Not because it was the most extreme, the fastest, or even the most beautiful, but because it showed the future with incredible clarity. At a time when Porsche was fighting for survival and was still defined by the 911, someone in Weissach understood that the future of the brand would depend on cars that were more practical, but still sporty. The 989 lost to economics, but won as an idea. Its spirit returned in the Panamera, and its styling traces can be found in later 911s. It was a car that did not save Porsche, even though that was its mission. Paradoxically, canceling it may have helped the brand survive, because it forced Porsche into a more realistic strategy. The 989 was too expensive, too ambitious, and too early. And that is exactly why it still captures the imagination today.